Of course, I'm not envious, but I'll say frankly you're lucky, Miss Hill. Your family, Mr. Thompson, is good. I don't remember quarreling. Everything is peaceful, oh well, and your son is glorious. With parents like that, how can he not be good? Mr. Thompson is your real father. Two short boards lay on the mound, and Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Peterson sat down there, meeting at the store. Mrs. Peterson to go to the next street, and has already come and. How often do you want to talk about everyday life? In response to her friend's praise, Mrs. Thompson sighed and looked at the withered flowers in the front garden, which swayed in the light wind. It will rain, she said, looking up at the sky. Inflate something. Mrs. Peterson, without waiting for an answer, got up and took the bag. Well, I'll go, it's time for me. You look at least sometimes, otherwise everything is in work. I'll take a look, Mrs. Peterson, I'll take a look. Mrs. Thompson hurried into the house. Den had already arrived from work and locked himself in his room. The other day he broke up with a girl, she was almost his bride, until he found out that he was dating someone else. The parting was difficult, Den still walks gloomy, and Mrs. Thompson, like any mother, is unbearably sorry for him. My son was 2 years old, I regretted it, now he is 20 years old, it's also a pity. It hurts to watch how it toils. Buck, would you eat? Later, Mom, I don't want to yet. But stop tormenting you, everything will pass, and this too, you will have a girlfriend and we will play such a wedding for you, and most importantly, you will live happily. Den still ate, monotonously chewing if only. Something to put in your mouth. I'll go to Dayster, said the son. Go, son, you can unwind. As soon as the son left, Mr. Thompson arrived from work. Mrs. Thompson, like many years ago, and today went forward, wanted to hug and stumbled upon her husband's cold gaze. Josh, what are you doing? She began to set the table, looking at her husband's gloomy face. He ate silently, almost as monotonously as Denver. What are you really? What is Dan, what are you? Both are down in the water. Mr. Thompson lifted his dark curly head with a light gray hair and looked at his wife attentively. Mrs. Thompson's hair was also dark and slightly wavy. From the very youth, people around admired this couple, considering them beautiful and happy. For 7 years Mrs. Thompson could not give birth. They already began to look askance at her, build various speculations, hinting at whether she could have children, and Mr. Thompson encouraged and said that they would have a son or daughter, you just have to wait and believe. Indeed, after 7 years of marriage, Miss Hill became pregnant and her relatives breathed a sigh of relief. After giving birth, she became depressed. As her friend Mrs. Peterson, with whom they were sitting on the mound an hour ago, said, there was no mood, her eyes were dull, she pressed the baby to herself and for no reason could burst into tears, and Mr. Thompson, on the contrary, flew on wings, circled like a dove at his dove diaper, washed, cooked porridge, if Mrs. Thompson had no time. Soon Mrs. Thompson's sadness passed and all the love that was in her heart gushed over her son and husband. Mrs. Thompson went up to her husband and touched his curly hair. Mr. Thompson removed her hand and dodged. Yes, what happened? Tell me already. I don't know yet, but I want to get to the bottom of the truth. Mr. Thompson pushed the plate away. I don't even know how to tell you. But let me ask you directly, and you will also answer me directly. Den from me? It became difficult for Mrs. Thompson to breathe, she froze, her hand automatically reached for her neck, as if wanting to free herself from the other collar of her blouse. John, what are you doing? Who gave you this idea? What difference does it make who said what? You answer me directly. Den from me or not? From you, of course, he is your son. Why did you blush then? Why are you stuttering? I know that Den is my son. He is not native in any case, here we are talking about something else, from me or not from you. Mrs. Thompson found the strength to answer firmly. Enough about it. Not only does your son walk around upset, but you also start. Mr. Thompson rose heavily from his chair, the conversation failed. Mrs. Thompson began to clean the dishes, nervous, dropping her fork and spoon, then quietly looked into the hall. Mr. Thompson carefully leafed through their family album, looking at his son's childhood photos and his own. Mrs. Thompson would have kept silent, biting her lip, not touching him, but inside everything was trembling with excitement. But what are you all up to? What are you comparing? What do you want to find out? It doesn't look like it at all, Mr. Thompson muttered, completely different in appearance. Yeah, he doesn't even look like you. Well, that means he looks like himself, Mrs. Thompson said. It happens. It is not necessary that children look like their parents. We got such a Denver. By the way, his hair is also dark like yours. Don't talk to me. I'll tell you what. Until today, there was not even a shadow of a doubt, but now everything has changed. There were people who were then with you on that business trip. Do you remember how, more than 20 years ago, you went to study for 2 weeks? You had some kind of retraining there. Mrs. Thompson felt hot. Her face seemed to be on fire. She looked at her husband, trying to find the right words. Yes, imagine meeting a classmate today. You can guess who exactly. She has been living in the city for a long time. That's why we haven't seen each other for so many years. So tell me, Miss Hill, who is Mr. Dipper? John, this is your son. Den is your son, the woman said wearily. Miss Hill, but you can check it. I'll do anything. Mr. Thompson spoke softly, but there was a metallic note in his voice. Mrs. Thompson sat down on the sofa, putting a white towel on her knees, was silent for a minute. There is no need to check anything, John, since this truth is destined to be revealed. It seemed to me all these years and myself that Den was your son. At first I even checked secretly. I thought I couldn't give birth, but they said that everything was fine with me. That's when I realized that I'm unlikely to give birth to you. She began fiddling with the towel, folding it neatly, then straightening it again. I didn't intend to change you. I loved, and then I loved, and now I love. It just happened, and when I realized that the child would be, I inspired myself that this is your child. Even when she grew up, she saw who she was becoming like, but she was still silent and could not leave you. Forgive me, John. Forgive me? Mr. Thompson jumped up and almost roared. This cry was like the roar of a wounded animal. You've been deceiving me all my life. How could you give birth to a child for me from someone there at your stupid studies? I could because I love it. Because you didn't have children. You lie. I don't believe. I am healthy as an ox. For the first time in her life, a hail of curses fell upon Miss Hill. He fell silent only when Den appeared on the threshold. The surprised look of the son stopped the parents. What's the cry? What happened? Nothing, son. Go to your place. We'll figure it out ourselves. No, wait. Mr. Thompson stopped his son. Why are you putting him to sleep like a little one? Can you sing a lullaby? He is a grown man already. He has the right to know the truth. Mr. Thompson walked up to his son, taking his hand. Sit down, son. Sit down. You are no longer small. You will not faint here by chance. It was revealed that I'm not your own father. You understand? Your mother gave birth to you from another man. This is how parsley comes out. Some kind of nonsense. Have you seen enough of the series, or what? The guy looked at his parents. He did not believe what he heard. Yes, what series? We have our own cinema here. Mr. Thompson began to walk around the room, rubbing his neck, as if a heavy load, which he had just thrown off, lay on it. It turns out the truth. Your mother just confessed. Mom, is this true? Mrs. Thompson threw away the towel, got up and went over to her son. True, son, it happened and I'll tell you everything. You see, Mr. Thompson shouted. It turns out that the truth has been hidden for 20 years. No, it's necessary to pretend like that. I didn't pretend. I loved you. Don't you dare talk to me about love. 3 days for you to move out of here. My parents' house is registered for me, and you go out. At least go to your sister. At least go to your mother in the area. I don't care. Mom, how is it? Why did you do this? Den's lips trembled. Calm down, son, let's talk calmly together, and then we'll leave here together. Let's go. Why is Den going with you? Mr. Thompson stopped in the middle of the room. Den is not to blame. Den, as he was my son, will remain so, even if at least a dozen children will be born to me. Otherwise, I know for sure that I will have children, but not from you. He approached his son. Den, stay. This is your home, and I am your father. I raised you, and there is nothing to your fault. Den, pack your things, Mrs. Thompson asked. We are leaving right now. So Flo also deceived me. The guy looked at his father. Are all women really like that, Dad? I'm standing next to you, Den. What are you saying? Now Mrs. Thompson screamed, her face flushed from screaming. Don't go crazy. I'm your mother, my own mother. Will you leave me? I'll leave it, my son calmly replied. Flo also deceived me, meeting with another, and now she got married, spitting in my soul, and it's not my father's fault that you cheated on him. So I stay with my dad. That's right, said Mr. Thompson, and taking a pillow, he went to sleep on another bed. Don't be afraid, I won't hurt your eyes. I'm leaving today, and you know, John, I think it's good that you found out, otherwise I couldn't decide on my own. Somehow it even became easier. It's just a pity for Den, he didn't understand. He suffers from Flo, the boy has an injury, that's why he refuses his own mother, and you use it. Mrs. Thompson spoke quietly so as not to wake her son and neatly folded things. You can take whatever you want out of things, Mr. Thompson said, splashing water from the washbasin in his face. I won't interfere. But why? We will act according to the law. We will file for divorce. Let the court divide the property. Mr. Thompson straightened up, holding the towels in his hands. Miss Hill, do you want to get divorced noisily so that everyone can hear? Can't do without a trial? I say take what you want. I'm not going to talk about the village that Den is not from me, as he was my son and will remain, and your betrayal is our business. Mrs. Thompson closed her suitcase and turned to Mr. Thompson. She liked her husband's proposal. Mrs. Thompson most of all wanted Den not to be affected by their divorce. Okay, so be it. I don't want people to gossip from Denver. She pointed to the pots and pans on the stove. I cooked pickle for you there, cutlets in a frying pan and pasta in a small saucepan, dumplings and minced meat are ready in the freezer. For the first time you will have enough, but I have to go to work. I'll go to Mr. Thompson in the evening, and for the weekend I'll go to the regional center to my mother. Mr. Thompson remained standing next to the washbasin with a towel in his hands. I woke up when the door slammed, sat on the sofa, and clasped my head in my hands, muffledly forgetting, as if an old wound ached. Dad, what are you? It's okay, son. Mother left for work. Dad, I won't leave you. Don't look that I'm still young. I also managed to survive the betrayal. It's okay, son, we'll break through. It's just all of a sudden. I thought she would say that all this is not true, but she confessed. A bitter smile appeared on her face. Look how conscientious you are. 3 months have passed since Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Thompson divorced. Den still lived with his father, only the house now seemed empty. Nothing, son, let's break through. Mr. Thompson repeated the same phrase, encouraging himself and his son. You're like Den. How do you look if, well, in general, I'll bring a woman to the house? Den shrugged. Well, you are right. I'm not old yet. There will be a family. There will be children. He approached his son and lightly patted him on the shoulder. Won't you be jealous of your father? Why are you? I understand everything. Do not be afraid. I will not be offended. Well, it's good. There is a lonely girl here, a woman, so to speak. In general, she is 30 years old. Her name is Mrs. Robinson. She began to meet, but I want to be serious, without deceit, so that everything is real. I understand, father, understand. Thank you, Den. You are a real man. Thank you for your support. Let a woman in the house eat and cook for us, otherwise you and I started a little in the house. By the way, are you calling your mother? Yes, she herself calls all the time, asking how I was here, calling me to her place. Well, what about you? I would go. It will manage, answered Den, but see for yourself, mother all the same. Mr. Thompson felt guilty as soon as he met Mrs. Robinson. Relieved from the heart and insulting Mrs. Thompson began to recede. It seemed to Mr. Thompson that he had a whole life ahead of him, a life without deceit, treason. In fact, she didn't call for 3 days, Den admitted, but earlier every day. So call and find out. Den took out his phone and dialed his mother's number. In response, they heard beeps. It's strange, she was always in touch, but then. The guy for the first time felt cut off from his mother. Daily calls became a habit, and it seemed that it would always be like this, and now not a single call from her for 3 days. And the subscriber is still unavailable. Call your grandmother, Mr. Thompson advised, maybe she knows something. Yes, Granny does not hear well, it is useless to talk to her. As soon as Den finished speaking, the bell rang. He himself did not believe it when he heard the voice of his grandmother. Granddaughter, come, she said, crying, or rather almost screamed into the phone. What's wrong? Come, granddaughter, she repeated. Well, nothing is clear at all, Den was surprised. The next day after lunch, he took time off from work and left on a ride to the regional center. Where is mother? He asked grandmother Mrs. Brown. So in the hospital, Mrs. Tombson, 3 days as in the hospital. How so? Why? First pressure, and then the heart. She called you, but you didn't answer, it upset you a lot. Den was stunned by the news. His mother never complained about her health. She was a beautiful blooming woman. When Mr. Thompson walked together, people looked around, admiring the beautiful couple, so it was difficult to believe that Den's mother was in the hospital. You go to visit her, be kind, granddaughter, she is your mother, she carried you under her heart. Okay, Grandma, I'll go right now. Den jumped out of his grandmother's small apartment and went to the district hospital. Who's roaming loud around here without a cape? A woman's voice came from behind Denver. I'm going to Mrs. Thompson, he replied to a tall, stately woman in a white coat. So, did the son show up? Well, yes, her son, how is she? So, for starters, wipe your shoes properly, get a cape, and then you go to the 5th ward, but first I will prepare. Well, what are you staring at? Listen to what the head nurse says. Yeah, I'll do it, the guy stammered. He entered the ward quietly, trying not to stomp. He was taken aback when he saw the pale Mrs. Thompson. She smiled. Hello, son, sit down, Mom got a little sick. Her beautiful face was haggard and sad. Mom, I did not know, honestly, I called yesterday, and you are not available. And, probably, the phone was discharged and did not take it in hand. How did you get here? Serious something? Nothing, they will heal here, my friend, Mrs. Bloom, that's how she lured me here. She says I urgently need to be treated. I had to obey, she is so tall, strict. Well, yes, everyone here is afraid of her, but she is good, they promised to write her out in 10 days. How are you there? What do you eat? Lose weight, look. Maybe you met someone? Do you have a girl? No moms yet. Oh son, how I want you to be happy, but don't worry about me, I'll get out. Den looked out the window and blinked his eyes, not wanting to show his mother his weakness. He was overwhelmed by what he saw, a lump in his throat. Mom, please get well, I will call you and Granny every day. He took her by the hand. Please forgive me, son. Don't blame yourself, I understand everything. You have just experienced a breakup with your girlfriend, your fiancée, and then there is such news, so you are confused. Den pursed his lips and was silent for a minute, stroking his mother's hand. Mom, I love you. Mrs. Thompson smiled. Son, I knew and believed it. I love you too, you go and don't worry. Mom, I'll come tomorrow. What about work? You need to ask for leave. And I'll ask for a vacation for a week, I have a good reason, my mother is in the hospital. He left the room and burst away a tear, glad that his mother did not see it on his face. So, Come here. Mrs. Bloom stood at the staff room like the White Tower, inspiring fear with her formidable appearance. All the medical staff obeyed her. They say even the head physician was afraid when 15 years ago she appeared with them. The chief physician, Mrs. River, after the first meeting, said that she was a grandiose woman. One of the nurses overheard her, and since then she has often been called Grand Margot. Listen here, child, she put her massive hand on Den's shoulders. You should not come to your mother empty-handed, understand? Only now Den was upset that he didn't even bring juice. I forgot, honestly, he admitted. Can I run to the store now and come back, buy some fruit? It's possible, I'll allow it. And buy flowers. Good. Den flew out of the hospital and rushed to the center, where there was a flower stall. Appeared half an hour later, grabbed a cape, called Mrs. Bloom. You promised to hold, he reminded. He handed the bouquet to you. Yes, not to me, Mother Flowers. Oh, you fool, just like my fools, you need to teach you everything. Well then, here it is. Den reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar. This is for you. Well, that's another matter. Let's indulge in sweets. She stopped at the ward. You give the transfer, kiss your mother and promise to be an exemplary son, understand me? Den nodded. The sight of Margarita made me obey every word. At home, he sat at the table with his father for a long time. The tea had long cooled down. They warmed it up from time to time. Then he left the mugs again. Do not be offended, Dad. I decided to move to my grandmother. I will wait for my mother from the hospital. When I found out that she did this to you, it seemed to me that you were the injured party, if I may say so, but now she is too weak. I want to hold my mother. I'm not offended, that's right. Mrs. Thompson has always been a good mother. You can't take that away from her. Yes, she was a good wife. Dad, get married. You have the right. I won't say anything. Den, how about work? Travel far. I will transfer. I will work in the district center. I've already decided everything. At the weekend, Den moved to his grandmother and began to visit his mother every day. Margarita Igorevna already met the guy with a smile, opened the door of the ward and announced, Miss Hill, meet the visitor, and then, in a free minute, she came in and sat down on the bed. You have a good son, Miss Hill. You shouldn't have worried. Thank you for supporting me. But what about, Miss Hill, do you remember 15 years ago I felt bad, I almost got divorced from Vitka, and you supported me. Now it's my turn. All this was, only John and I could not be connected. It's because you're too conscientious, the other would hold on to the end and not confess. So now decide for yourself, most importantly Den is with you with all my heart. Den, say hello? You are rushing somewhere like a hurricane. In a hurry, the head nurse stopped Den with bouquets of flowers with a shout. Out of breath, he almost ran down the corridor without noticing anyone. Oh, Mrs. Bloom, hello, my mother is being discharged, so I'm in a hurry. I see you are flying at full sail. Almost knocked Kate off her feet. Den turned around and saw a young nurse walking into the ward. Her blonde hair was hidden under a snow-white medical cap and only light curls were knocked out at the temples, swaying with every step she took. Den froze in place, looked at the nurse until she disappeared into the ward. I was in a hurry in vain. The extract is not yet ready. Besides, Kate is doing an injection now, so she will have to wait. So what? I'll wait. I'll sit down there. Den remembered the flowers and gave one of the bouquets, he had two, to the head nurse. Mrs. Bloom, thank you for your help. The woman smiled. Oh, Den, again you mixed up. What's wrong? The guy was surprised. Here's the second bouquet for Mom, and this is like gratitude to you. Mrs. Bloom slightly opened the door to the ward. Look, she whispered, Kate is giving an injection to your mother, and there were also droppers and other procedures. Is it their business? In a kind word, Kate knows how to support and reassure. You better give this nurse a bouquet. Den looked at Margarita with surprise. Yes, I'm saying exactly, give her flowers. You'll see, you'll remember Mrs. Ritter with a kind word." She laughed. Den saw in this grandiose Margot, as her colleagues called her, a sweet and kind woman. Taking his mother from the hospital, Den left his father and settled with his mother and grandmother. I often saw Mr. Thompson once a week, visited him, but did not stay for a long time. He sits for an hour and a half and leaves. It was strange to see a stranger in the house. The furniture has been rearranged, other curtains on the windows, other utensils, and most importantly, the new mistress of the house. Short, pretty Mrs. Robinson, with a smile on her face, tried to please Den every time. "Stay a little longer," my father asked. "Tell me what's new with you." "Yes, everything is the same as before, I already told you." Den was silent, then when they went out the gate he admitted that everything had changed. "You yourself see what to do." "I did not expect such a sharp turn." "Tell me, how is your mother? How does she feel? Is everything all right?" "She has such a cool friend. She works as a head nurse in a hospital. It was she who made her mother heal." "Wow, how many years they lived and Miss Hill did not complain about her health." "Well, don't get sick anymore." Mr. Thompson wanted to say hello, but did not dare. "How are you on the personal front?" Instead of saying hello, he asked. Den hesitated. "How can I tell you, while it is only planned, but there is a girl," the son admitted. 2 months have passed since he was discharged from the hospital, and for Den the day of his discharge became the day he met Kate. He gave that bouquet intended to Mrs. Bloom, on the advice of Mrs. Bloom herself, to Nurse Kate, and their acquaintance began. Mrs. Thompson knew that her son was meeting with a nurse from the district hospital, but she was silent and did not hurry to ask questions. On the contrary, Den began to ask questions. "Mom, just don't worry, I want to talk about one topic, maybe unpleasant for you." Mrs. Thompson sat opposite. "Den, I listen carefully, speak boldly." "In general, I wanted to know about the man with whom you met. Perhaps you want to know who your father is, your biological father?" She began to stroke the tablecloth with her palm, as if she wanted to straighten out a slight wrinkle. "I know very little about him. We met by chance and parted very quickly. I did everything so that he did not find me. He didn't even know my last name. Sometimes he was mentioned in the newspaper. He then held a fairly high position in the region and had just divorced. I left and deliberately did not seek meetings with him. And if you want to know more about him, then the library stores all the issues of our regional newspaper. He was often written about in it, and there is a portrait of him. He died 10 years ago. I also learned about this from the newspaper. His name was Mr. Dipper. Understand, son, despite the fact that your biological father, Mr. Dipper, I always loved your dad. Mr. Thompson was your real father, because he raised you, worried about you no less than I did. I know it, Mom. I know you don't need to make excuses. I go to the library and read the newspapers. I just need to know something about him." Den has not been to the library since his school years, and in high school he went there only when necessary. This time I spent more than 2 hours leafing through old files, peering into different faces. Several reports caught my eye and even one photograph. He peered into the stranger's face and found familiar features in it. In the first instant, he began to remember where he had seen this face, and then he realized that he simply looked like this person who did not know and did not guess about his existence. He left the hall tired, but with a feeling of some lightness in his soul. He felt unbearably sorry for his mother, father, and even this stranger, Mr. Dipper. I wanted to live in such a way that in 10 and 20 years and in 30 years I would not make mistakes. "Well, hello, Miss Hill, here I am." Mr. Thompson stopped in the hallway, not deciding to take off his jacket. "Hello, John, undress, wash your hands. Come to the table, we'll have lunch together." Miss Hill, dressed at home, moved the table. Mr. Thompson willingly took off his jacket, abruptly went to the bathroom. "As Den said, I called you right away. The son decided to marry, though I have not yet seen the bride. A very good bride. Nice girl. I think you'll see more. Den promised to call on you with Rose." maybe even tomorrow. Mr. Thompson sat down at the table coughing slightly. Got a cold or something? No, just a cough. I stopped by to discuss how to organize a celebration. The money will come by itself. Well, you need to think about the gift. Do you think we will give separately or together? I don't know how you want, but you don't seem to be alone now. Yes, do not understand one or not one. I hurried, moved then. Yes, where does Mrs. Robinson, John, and Mrs. Robinson? It's not her fault that we broke up so quickly. Miss Hill, I was in a hurry. What kind of children do I have now? Whiskey is already gray, and it is unlikely that there will be children. I have one son, this is Denver. So what can we do for the young as a gift? Let's reunite, shall we? Mrs. Thompson covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders began to tremble. She tried to cry silently. Miss Hill, don't cry. You understand me. Find out this. And do you know through whom? Through Samely. And do you know where I met her? In the city, in a spare parts store. She divorced a man. She got one of the shops. She is now the hostess there. While I was talking with the seller, she recognized me. She came out smiling. But do you remember how she ran after me at school? In general, word for word, hints that the woman is free, invites to her place, but I laughed and said in my eyes, it didn't work out in my youth, but now there's nothing to try. She was offended by my words. Well, she said that she had seen you. I did not believe it, went out and left. Then you know yourself. The thought stuck. I decided to find out nevertheless. Well, I found out. Mrs. Thompson sighed. Let's have dinner. Miss Hill, well, since everything was figured out, let's get together, because I love you, and you love me. That's right, John, we have love, but now there will be no happiness. I will always feel guilty before you. No, John, we will not succeed. Why did you decide that I will not forgive? Maybe I've already forgiven. You know, John, the more you love, the harder it is to forgive. Let's play a wedding for our son. I'm so grateful to you for Denver. You are the best father in the world. Well, so be it. It's not time yet. He looked at Mrs. Thompson as if trying to remember. What are you looking at? I haven't seen you for a long time. I can't even believe that you're near. You know, I registered the house on Den, but the heir is ours. Well, let's have lunch and talk about the wedding. After all, it will be hard for me to cope alone, and the main thing in this whole situation is for you and me to remain good people in front of each other. The wedding is the same. My son had a fabulous wedding. The children were incredibly happy, while Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Thompson remained on good terms. However, now everyone had their own home.